today that includes brief introductions by all of the speakers and myself, as well as, and that's going to last for about the first 50 minutes of our talk. We have a good 30 minutes scheduled at the end to answer the audience questions, which Noelle is going to help me to field, and then we'll have a brief close. So to introduce myself, my name is Willow Lung Amam. I am an associate professor in the Urban Studies and Planning program at the University of Maryland, College Park. I am also Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education, which is a 4-school research center on our campus. Most of my work centers around issues of suburban inequality, and particularly centering on issues of neighborhood change and the politics of development and redevelopment in areas that are rapidly changing, and how these produce new forms of racialized inequality. I've written one and now working on a second manuscript. The first, Trespassers, Asian Americans, and the Battle for Suburbia, focused in on Asian immigration in the Silicon Valley and the politics of development in this relatively affluent suburban region, and how some of the discourses and the politics that took place on the ground really marginalized some of the immigrant communities that were increasingly calling Silicon Valley home. My new book manuscript is focusing on issues of suburban poverty and redevelopment in the DC region, which I now live in, and looking at the ways in which gentrification and some of the equitable development organizing are taking place on the ground in suburban communities in my own backyard. And this is in part to sort of decenter the gentrification discourses outside of the center city context, which I think we're very familiar with hearing those kind of discourses as they take place, but also to kind of deepen our understanding about the ways in which specific types of suburban processes and politics are taking shape in a suburban context in ways that deepen our understanding of gentrification politics. And so today's conversation is in line with those interests and scholarship, and I'm very honored that our group of panelists have joined me in this conversation today. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves in a little bit so I don't butcher their biographies, which are very extensive. But also, before we do that, I did wanna give a brief introduction to our talk today. So I'm sure that most of our attendees know that some of the recent murders and violence of Black men, women, queer, and transgender folks that we have seen broadcast across the media worldwide have taken place in suburbs. This is including Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, Elijah McClain in Aurora, Colorado, Sandra Bland in Waller County, Texas, and even here in DC, in my own backyard, Natasha McKenna after being tased by officers in a Fairfax County jail. But these are not isolated incidents, just as police violence is not isolated incidents. More than twice as many police killings actually happen in suburban areas rather than in urban areas, in part because most of America lives in the suburbs. Americans have been majority suburban for over decades now. Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, was also born of suburban uprising following the killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida, in a gated community in Florida, and then became a global movement following the uprisings in Ferguson, an inner ring suburb of St. Louis. And so while we've seen a lot of the uprisings that have happened in the last several weeks, several months, have also happened in a suburban context. We've in fact seen probably more suburban protests than at any other time in our modern history. And for those who study suburbia like myself, it's probably not surprising to see such violent forms of policing happening in suburbs, as well as such tremendous uprising in suburbs, because we know that these things have been happening for a long time, but this is a particular moment of change in a suburban context, particularly in light of the rapid shifts that we've seen over the last several decades in the geographies of Black and Brown communities and the geographies of immigrant communities that have now reconstituted in suburbia as the majority communities, and also the reconstitution of racial segregation and concentrated poverty in those suburbs. But yet our discourses about urban uprising, about police violence, continue to center the center city as the location of such violence, but also the center of protest that seeks to undo some of the state-led practices and the structural conditions that produce such violence. So this not only reinforces ideas about where things are happening and erases specific forms of violence that are happening in suburbia, but it also doesn't lead us towards effective solutions. Because if we don't understand policing and other forms of state-led violence as happening in suburbs, we're also not underscoring the kind of spatial practices that are deeply embedded in these forms of what we often think of as social practices. So we have to understand some of the underlying logics, some forms of control, segregation, and violence that are embedded in particular geographies and built environments in order to better disrupt them. And so our conversation today is really seeking to center the suburban in our conversations about contemporary policing, state-led violence and protest, and seeking to uncover different forms of possibility that this framing allows us in terms of opening up our understanding of the current moment and the possibilities of that moment. And as I've said already, I am so honored by this team of folks who have decided to join us today. They include some of the scholars who have written the foremost and most present tense books about these issues in the last several years. Each of the scholar activists on a panel has a recent book about this, and some have forthcoming books as well. And so I'm so honored for them to join us. So starting with Jody Rios, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jody Rios, and I study the cultural politics of race in relationship to the policing of metropolitan space in the United States. And so prior to getting my PhD in visual and narrative culture, I taught architecture and urban studies for 15 years at Washington University in St. Louis. And it was there in the early 2000s that I became aware of extreme yet seemingly invisible policing practices that were taking place in an area of historically white suburbs known as North St. Louis County. And over the past 50 years, the same area has become majority Black, with the fastest transition occurring between 1970 and 1990. It's also the area where Ferguson is located, although Ferguson is a much older and much larger city than most of the cities in North St. Louis County. And while many people in this area believe that this area has lost its, or in the region believe that the area has lost its suburban status, the imagination of suburban space, which is understood as white and protected, is still vehemently used to police residents and extract resources from people who are described as urban, which is kind of code and understood as Black and unprotected. Like Ferguson, these cities have become increasingly dependent on fines and fees generated through predatory policing, since as Black families moved to the area, resources moved out due to the risk that is historically attached to Blackness. So this is the double bind of living as Black in the historically white suburbs, at least in St. Louis, and I would argue in many places around the United States, in that Black residents both suffer from and pay for the economic loss that occurs when they simply occupy space. And it's not a coincidence that this is the geography from which we have seen current forms of protest emerge. It's a place where the everyday policing of people who, quote, don't know how to live in the suburbs, as one official has put it, often amounts to a lifetime of indebtedness, harassment, and even death. So the visibility of Michael Brown's desecrated body on that day in August of 2014 had particular resonance in a place where state-sanctioned violence is not exceptional, but mundane. And it gave rise to a different visibility that reconfigures Blackness as a location that exists beyond the map drawn by racial capitalism and beyond the registers that are recognized by the liberal state. So my research, which kind of the culmination of about 20 years spent both working in and then working with in terms of the study of both qualitative and quantitative data over kind of on and off over this 20-year period, shows that contrary to popular belief, the suburbs are a place where we find extreme yet invisible forms of policing, as well as radical practices of freedom. And so really those are those two sides of the same coin are how the book that has just come out, Black Lives and Spatial Matters, Policing Blackness and Practicing Freedom in Suburban St. Louis is structured between these two very extreme cases that we find in the suburbs of St. Louis.
Thank you, Jody. Andrea?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'll start off by saying, first off, I'm born and raised in St. Louis. And so I'm going to just provide some things to help you have context, more or less, about how my research developed and the angle in which I take in terms of explaining it and accounting for it. So several things. I've been covering Black citizen police conflict in the St. Louis region since roughly around 2009. So it's been over a little over 10 years maybe that I have done that. And I have accounted more or less for the suburban spaces because there has generally been a wealth of data, a wealth of research that has centered urban communities. Black folks don't just live in the inner city, right? They don't just live in urban space. And so for me, in order for us to have a holistic understanding of what the Black experience looks like in terms of law enforcement exchanges and so forth, that needed to be expanded, right? And so for me, it was expanding it here in St. Louis, expanding it to a community where there had already been decades upon decades, like many communities, of racial tension, expanding it to a community that had essentially faced erasure and was invisible by all standards, particularly in terms of their experiences and otherwise, and in a community where there had also been DOJ intervention. So Ferguson was not the first time in St. Louis, in the St. Louis region, where there had been DOJ intervention and where there had also been space and opportunity for an uprising. And so there are some political dynamics that play into that I account for in my work. And so with that said, I am also the author of 2 books, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, again, where I have extended urban studies into suburban space, and where I argue essentially that policing, Black folks and police exchanges are heightened. In fact, fear increases, threat levels increases, and I argue those things based off of race, place, and effect and more. For Black folks, there is something to be said when they cross out of urban space into quote unquote imagined white suburban space. Those dynamics are heightened, they are exacerbated. And so what those things look like, I have also extended to a second book. And that book is the more recent work entitled You Can't Stop the Revolution, Community Disorder and Social Ties in Post-Ferguson America. A couple other things to keep in mind as I talk about assumptions about Black folks, right? Much of my work characterizes and chronicles and documents and accounts for disparagement, the ongoing disparagement and ideology attached, the often false ideology and these notions that are attached to where Black folks are, how they occupy space and where they reside and those kinds of things. And so there's a theme, a running theme with that that extends well beyond even the physical. And so on that note, I would like to also state that I am the criminologist and sociologist, or critical criminologist to be exact, and sociologist that was on the ground within a couple of hours of Brown's death. And I was on the ground accounting and documenting the exchanges and all the uprising as it was taking off well before the world tuned in. This is important to state, not particularly because I matter, I'm most important in the grand scheme of things, but in the spirit of erasure and in the spirit of invisibility that is oftentimes attached to folks and how information comes to be accounted for and disseminated, how we think about or imagine Black folks and what spaces they occupy, that includes me. And so I want to be clear that my accounting is about not only what space Black folks occupy and assumptions about them as they spill into suburban space, but to also be clear about assumptions that are not just simply residential, but even intellectual. And so where do Black folks reside and how do they exist and how do they move forward these theoretical ideas and assumptions about notions of who's doing what, when, where, and how, even in intellectual space or academia. And so on that note, I think I will just go ahead and save the rest for later and pass it on to the next colleague.
Thank you so much, Andrea. LaRue, you're muted. LaRue, you're muted. Could you unmute, please?
I don't think he can.
He can't.
Or can we unmute him?
All right, great. So I'm here. Sorry about that.
All right.
So by way of introduction, my name is LaRue Lewis McCoy, and I'm an associate professor of the sociology of education here at New York University. In particular, what I do is study suburban space and suburban inequality. I came to studying suburban space because I'm Black and I was born and raised in a suburb. When I started to look at sociology of race and ethnicity and place and urban planning, I felt I didn't exist in the literature. So I wanted to understand more fully what are the sets of experiences that I had versus the sets of experiences of folks who may share my race, my gender identity, and class identity, but be in different places. So the first book that I wrote around this was called Inequality, well, it still is called Inequality in the Promised Land, Race, Resources, and Suburban Schooling. And what I do in there in particular is look at a suburb in the Midwest, which I call Rolling Acres, and try to look at what does inequality look like in places that are supposed to be desegregated, places that are integrated, places that are ideal, the kind of place that folks say, I want to move there because it's so diverse, it looks like, you know, a Benetton ad. Right? And lo and behold, when I went into schools in Rolling Acres, one of the first things I found was, while there are places that the children of fast food workers sit next to the children of physicians, there are plenty of spaces within schools that segregation happens. There are multiple forms of bias that Black children and lower income children are contending with in these spaces, as well as even the neighborhoods within these desegregated and integrated spaces are quite segregated themselves. So I'm an ethnographer by training, so I very much like to follow people around. And when I produce Inequality in the Promised Land, folks were like, this is really interesting. And it came out as Ferguson started to erupt and people started to have questions about suburbs. And they were like, oh my gosh, I want to read your book so I can understand Ferguson. And I'm like, well, you can read it, but it's not that kind of suburb, right? And I realized through sets of conversations that I was having with people, we often carry a monolithic notion of what suburban is. So my second book, which I am currently still working my way through, is entitled Suburban Spoils, which concentrates predominantly on questions of housing opportunity and educational opportunity. And in this one, what I wanted to do was to really think more critically about the role in which race, ethnicity, and citizenship status play in how people gain access to what some call the American dream, as well as how people compete for resources. So one of the first concepts I used in Inequality in the Promised Land was opportunity hoarding, which I drew from Charles Tilly and brought into the educational space. But I felt like there's still a lot of misunderstanding of how things are competed for in these places outside of the city. So this work is largely based in Westchester County in 2 different municipalities, one being Yonkers and New Rochelle. If you're familiar with the area, it's just north of New York City. And even when I sometimes talk about it, folks are like, well, Yonkers, is that really a suburb? And we'll talk about that in a moment. I like to pull apart our assumptions about these spaces so we can figure out who gets what. For me, I think that it is absolutely central that our work move to looking more carefully at the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, place, and power. And if we do that, we can actually start to rewrite the narrative around suburban space and incorporation. I'll end with saying, as in the midst of working through this book and in the midst of living with the pandemic of COVID, seeing New Rochelle being the site for, quote, ground zero or a super spreader, and seeing literally a containment zone set around the white side of town, assuming that you could contain it in that area and it wouldn't impact other places, but now seeing it concentrated in places where Black folks are in town, as well as seeing people march in the streets to call for support around the killing of George Floyd and actually bring folks to justice. 2 days later in New Rochelle, a Black man, Kamal Flowers, was gunned down. And so those same folks have been raising their voices and trying to get heard at the local, state, and national level. But there is a way in which if you are Black, if you are lower income, if you are brown, if you don't have the appropriate citizenship status or pedigree, your voice gets muted in these discourses.
So much, LaRue. So I want to start off our discussion by just questioning the very premise that I put forward in the call for this webinar, which is that the current Black Lives Matter movement and the movement against anti-Black violence and racism more broadly is often read through an urban lens. So I'm wondering if the panelists can begin by talking just about the ways in which the current frame, how that frame manifests and how it might help or hinder our understanding of this current movement. And as I do that, I also just want to say that I have invited these 3 guests to not as a panel, but what we have called a suburban party. And so I welcome them to discuss amongst themselves and really raise the kind of questions that they think are central to the current moment.
So I'll go ahead and get started.
Whoever wants to.
Oh, do you want me to go, Willow? Sorry about that. So I'll go ahead and start off with, there's a historical relegating of Black folks, right? Where Black folks are situated. So this is not a new thing. There is also a long-standing history in terms of how suburban space came to be created, what that has looked like, you know, post-emancipation and so forth. And one of the things that I particularly account for, especially in the first book, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, and even through to the current, You Can't Stop the Revolution, is sundown towns. I've looked at those kinds of spaces, right, where the idea was to create or identify and occupy not only all spaces by white populations, but in a particular way that will allow for safety, so to speak, pseudo safety for white people. This idea about being far away or situated away from Black folks who were supposed to be inherently criminal. The idea of threat, right? So if we go back to enslavement, the idea had been about the possibility of slave insurrections and those kinds of things. And so tracking Black spaces and what that means in terms of white safety, that has extended itself through the history of sundown towns. And it has extended itself into the creation of suburbs, places that are predominantly white, and not predominantly white by accident, but actually predominantly white on purpose. That is not a coincidence in that we have those communities. And so when we talk about suburban space, the idea of being away from Black folks, inner city folks, the idea of being away, quote unquote, from impoverishment, this idea about impoverishment, this idea about the undesirables, but being close enough to urban space to have the, or benefit from the amenities. Those kinds of things I think matter in terms of even today, how we think about law enforcement, how we think about where Black folks are, where these exchanges take place. The fact of the matter is people don't think about that. And that is the reason that we are having this conversation. People do not consider and take into account threat levels and what those kinds of exchanges look like when Black folks have, quote unquote, crossed out of what has been perceived historically as Black space and now are residing in, quote unquote, imagined white space, and what that means in their everyday experience. The idea has been that when Black folks are residing in suburban space, that somehow they have arrived. And what I have found is that that's not true. Not particularly for a lot of communities. We don't often think about or have conversations about Black folks in suburban space as being an extension of the ghetto, so to speak, being an extension of, impoverishment and all those kinds of things. And so I think that as we have these conversations, as we think about police, Black citizen conflict, we ought to think about, or at least flip on its head, this notion about where people are being, Black folks particularly, where they come to be victimized at and why. How does that look like? And that is not just playing out in urban inner city space. We need to get away from this idea, even when we talk about urban studies, the assumption, the underlying assumption is that that's Black studies, that's code, that's translation for Black studies. Those kinds of assumptions are in effect a hindrance in terms of how we move the ball forward, how we think about revolution, how we think about Black advancement outside of the confounds of white dictation. And so I will just sort of, I'll circle back later and talk about more extensively what that has looked like in terms of revolution, or this idea about movement, work on the ground, what that has looked like, how we talk about it, how it shows up in the narratives, and the fact that oftentimes space doesn't get accounted for in the narratives, and what that means for mobilization for Black folks, irrespective of inner city space.
Yeah, no, I mean, Andrea said nearly everything I want to say. I would just add that as Willow, as you provided some context, the extrajudicial killing of Black folks has increased in suburban spaces over time. The calls, the emergence of Black Lives Matter, whether attached to Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Corinne Gaines, these are often spaces outside of central cities that people forget about. And the more Black folks who are present, the less they are even discussed. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there are also regional dynamics at play. And as we're thinking about what kind of training, what kind of techniques and tools that police use in interaction with people, then we have to also consider that folks who went into a job thinking about control, thinking about power, right? Thinking about the protection of property, they were rarely thinking about Black people having property, being fully human, and occupying the same space. So I think sometimes the tensions around that are very clearly illustrated. So as Andrea has said, and Jody have pointed out, the use of fines and fees, right? The use of physical force that exists in suburban spaces, which are often fractured municipalities, small spaces where people are trying to figure out, how do we make this tax money work? Okay, we're going to double tax people who are traveling through. So if you look Black, if you look brown, we're gonna find ways to literally fine you and to hold up this infrastructure on the backs of people who initially were not considered for this project of American suburbanization.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I would just tag on right at the end here is circling back to the power of the spatial imaginary. And Willow, when you talk about how policing and protest are framed between, framed as urban, but in reality is really taking place in the suburban context, I think we have to just kind of call it what it is. It's a coding, as Drea brings up, that if it's Black, it's got to be attached to the urban. And when we talk about suburban, it's very intentionally conjuring up something that's very separate, that, you know, if Black folks live there, they are assumed to be in, have arrived in some some better position, which we know really isn't the case. And the other thing I would talk about too is just that in my studies, and I contrast in the book the difference between a place like Ferguson and a place like Pagedale, which is also in North St. Louis County, is much smaller, was developed in a completely different way, and has had Black leadership since, all Black leadership since 1982. And was actually the first, Pagedale was the first city in the entire country to have all Black, all female leadership in 1982. And so it made national headlines at that time. And so it's, you know, you would think that with the, you know, quote, progress that was made in terms of local autonomy, in terms of political enfranchisement, you know, the women who were elected into office at that time really thought that they were playing by the rules and that they were going to reap the benefits of suburban space. Suburban space became urban space almost immediately, and you can look at how it's talked about. I found it really interesting to see how the space of North St. Louis County was reported in terms of, you know, was it coded as urban or suburban? And even around the time that Michael Brown died, just prior to his death, the Normandy School District was taken over by the state. And so there was a big controversy, a lot of debate going on over what was happening with the school district. And every newspaper article framed it as an urban school that sat in a suburban context. But when Michael Brown was murdered and was laying on the street of on a suburban street in suburban St. Louis, so it flipped in terms of what the work of space was doing. So, you know, when it was reported as a suburban street, it was like, oh my gosh, look what's happening in the suburbs. You know, look what Black folks are doing in the suburbs. Look at this protest, it's in the suburbs. At that time, it was talked about as happening in the suburbs. Interestingly, really to kind of show that contrast of, you know, out of place people, at least that was my reading. So these codifications change, they can change gradually and they change overnight, depending on what they're intended to do.
Great, and just piggybacking off of that, I wonder if we can just break down this notion of suburb more concretely, and also think about the way that the notion of suburb is changing. And Jody, you alluded to this in a lot of different ways, in which the ways in which the slippages of urban and suburban happen based upon our understanding of who is the presumed subject of the spatial context, right? What's the container? And I think all of you guys have talked about the assumptions about Black folks and which spaces they occupy, and the assumptions about suburbia as white space. So can you talk about what we mean and what the importance of thinking about the suburban, and how it might be changing in a context in which most Black folks live in suburbs?
Yeah, so I'll offer just some initial thoughts. When we think about what a suburb is, people often, what comes to mind is an image of a standalone home, a manicured lawn, maybe a picket fence, definitely a white family, and a dog, right? There has been a way in which the imagination of the suburban has dominated our actual will to even question what a suburb is. So there are a couple different ways to think about it. I know as a sociologist who does a lot of reading, urban planners and other folks have talked about the emergence of suburbs after the World War. So you have places like Levittown, which are invested in financially via the government and private dollars to create spaces where literally you could be Black and build the home, but you could not get a lease in the area, right? And that kind of begins the way that many people think about contemporary suburbs. They're cookie cutter, they are very carefully engineered, and the people who move to them have tried to escape the city. For whatever reason, they think they'll have a better life, they'll have more control over municipal resources. When the suburbs first started, schools weren't the driving amenity, but very much so. When people think about suburban now, they're thinking, I choose a house and I choose the school, and the school is a good school or it's a bad school. So very much the decisions around real estate and school are tied together. Now, demographers, particularly in sociology, have done a really basic back of the napkin kind of way of dealing with suburbs, right? So they look at a metropolitan statistical area, they look at the census data, and they say, all right, there's one big city and there's places outside of the city, but it all falls into this area, this catchment area. And they're like, well, anything that's not inside of the central city, if it's outside, that's a suburb. It works and it doesn't work, because the truth of the matter is, no matter which city you pick, as you go around that city, you're going to see some very different organizations of social life. You'll find some places that have different structures around taxation, different structures around what you can do, places where you have to keep your lawn cut at a certain length, places where it's very much more exurban, right? Formerly rural and has been incorporated. There's a lot of variation there. What I think is most important for me when I think about what a suburb is, we can think about the literal definitions that we have. Suburbs tend to be less dense. Suburbs tend to have a predominance of single family homes. Suburbs tend to have low numbers of apartment buildings and low numbers of renters historically. But there is still the suburban, which is different than the definition of suburb, right? And suburban conjures up this notion of a white space, of a well-appointed space, and a space of choosing. So when we think about a number of cities, you can be in the middle of a city and someone will be like, oh, that's a suburban neighborhood over there, right? One of the complications of even talking about the suburbs for me as a sociologist has been like, oh, you study the suburbs like Mary Patillo. And I have to remind them, Mary Patillo never took a step outside of Chicago in her ethnographic work. It may be suburban in some of the notions that you have around ownership, around direction. However, the categories have a lot of slippage. What I think is important now is that many people, when they hear suburban, they think it has to be white. So when they hear about a Ferguson, when they hear about a Yonkers, when they hear about an East Point, they're like, well, those can't be suburbs, right? Well, truly they can. At the core of that is often a sense of anti-Black racism that doesn't allow Black people to occupy spaces and not see them as less valued than when they're occupied by white folks. So we can also talk about the complications around tax bases, but I think that kind of all goes into what is often a complex stew around what defines a suburb and suburban that is too often not interrogated, because most urban studies, most sociology, most demography, most economics has had a fascination, if not a fetish, with the urban.
I'll add, excuse me, I'll add, and I'm going to shout out to Mary Patillo Doomy. I love Mary.
Oh,
so
I love Mary dearly. That's the homie.
Send a shout out to her. So, but what I will add to what Doomy said is that, you know, suburban space. So people would argue and say, okay, we've heard all that these scholars are saying about, you know, white space and white thought and those kinds of things. But let's say, for example, Ferguson was predominantly Black. People would argue that that's a predominantly Black suburb, right? What I have tried to do is to have a conversation about Ferguson and also situate it within a broader history of the region. And also beyond the St. Louis region, like what does this mean? And what has history looked like in terms of even the state? People think about Ferguson. You can't have a conversation about Ferguson without understanding that Missouri extended. It was an extension of slavery, enslavement, right? It extended the boundaries of enslavement as like asking, seeking, literally in every way imaginable to expand as a slave state. Those kinds of things make a difference. When we talk about municipalities and the arrangement and the setup of that, here's the thing. Black folks on the street, Black folks on the ground, they have a clear understanding of what that looks like and means in their everyday experiences. Many of the participants talk to me. They call off those boundaries, those racialized boundaries, those intersecting places, right? They clearly understand once I cross this street, the police is going to be on me. Literally, there is a clear, if I just need to just kind of step out, I'm just gonna, put it in place. When I cross this street, here they come. The jump out boys are going to be on me. When I turn this corner, the jump out, this overlapping. So there is an understanding in the everyday experience crossing out of these inner city, quote unquote, boundaries into suburban, whether it is predominantly a predominantly Black suburban space or not. The truth of the matter is, while Ferguson may have been predominantly Black, it was still structured and situated within a white imagination of what space should look like and mean, and the idea of segregating and containing Black people, particularly based off or centered around, whether it is overtly identified or not, by policy centered around this idea of threat. I have often talked about how people have been oblivious to the notion that there has been a racial problem in their community. How could you be oblivious to that and not understand when you have an identifiable Black side of town and an identifiable affluent, more affluent white side of town, and poor, disparaged Black side of town, where Mike Brown is killed? You know, that was one Section 8 apartment complex after the other. It is now a stigmatized area. It had pretty much been that prior to his death. It was predominantly Black, again, side of Ferguson. And so I think those kinds of things is important in the conversation. I think it's important to think about, even in terms of how we have these holistic conversations, right? The holistic understanding, and about accounting for people. People know full well what their experiences look like when they cross into these suburban spaces, and the fact that we don't necessarily speak to it or account for it means more erasure. It means more invisibility. It means that we are having a conversation without accounting for folks who live there every day, because most folks don't even know they exist. These communities, many of which, one particularly Meacham Park, people for the most part didn't even know the community existed until a Black man walked into City Hall and opened fire in a city council rampage. That made national and international news. Now they know Black folks are there. But that should not be the case. It didn't have to be the case. And so it is so important and consequential for us to, if we're going to have these conversations, if we're going to talk about them, we can't talk about them based on these regional, sort of go-tos, these inner city kind of characterizations. We need to have the conversation, because we further invisibility for Black folks when we don't situate them, when we don't find them, and when we don't account for their experiences across all racialized boundaries, be it suburban, rural, or otherwise.
Just again to piggyback on what Drea is talking about, and you're absolutely, obviously spot on. I think that one of the really important aspects of when we talk about what is suburban is that structuring that you're talking about, Drea, that is historically embedded in these areas. And so as you all know, Drea, that the fragmented geography was developed as a means of exclusion and isolation by white communities who were moving also out of the city at that time. And initially, some of these areas were developed in the 1890s and around the turn of the century as garden suburbs for summer residences of very wealthy white St. Louisans, and then later filled in as kind of post-war suburbs for working class residents who were really claiming their whiteness. So you had a lot of European immigrants who would, like, again, I'm going to use the case of Pagedale, but you got a lot of German immigrants settling in parts of Pagedale that were all kind of moving together and claiming the so-called, American dream, or the promised land that Dumi talks about in his work. But when Black folks started moving to a place like Pagedale, there was no way that the suburb was going to make them white, right? So, that's really where the first aspects of this, like, oh my gosh, we can't call it the suburbs anymore, because how could it be suburban? And I mean, it seems so simple, but you know, it was one of the things when I first started looking at this area, it was such a debate. People would talk about like, yes, it's suburban because and they would list off all of the physical aspects. You know, it's single family homes. It's, you know, it has the white picket fences. So, or you know, it's not suburban because it's poor and it's, you know, economically struggling, and so, you know, all of these kind of coded ways of, or it's the suburban ghetto, or it's the Black suburbs, which really would need to be qualified from historically Black suburbs versus historically white suburbs. So, I mean, all of these qualifications, you have to start to wonder, like, as people who do urban studies and study urban space, like how are these really useful in terms of perpetuating? I think deconstructing these codifications and the terminologies are really useful. However, like how are we perpetuating? You know, do we really have to put like, yes, I've decided that this is absolutely it was also really interesting because I asked over 100 people in these very fairly quick surveys about, is St. Louis, North St. Louis County, is it a suburban area or is it an urban area? And it was really interesting how those responses broke down across race and across gender and across age. And it was completely surprising to me. And then so beyond that, you would ask, okay, well, what defines a suburban area, or what defines an urban area? And almost uniformly, the white residents talked about physical features. So it's quiet, it's not dense, you have to have a car. So it's all of these, you know, physical features. Black residents talked about expectations. So, and who lives there. So it's, you know, well, Black people live here, so it can't be the suburbs. You know, I can do this here, but I can't do that here, so it's not suburban. Or so it was interesting also in the sense of where Black residents felt like it was, you would think, when I asked white respondents, is it harder or easier for Black residents to live in North St. Louis County? And they would answer, oh, it's easier because it's not the city, it's less crime, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Black residents would say, absolutely, it's easier to live in the city because the police aren't on me all the time, I'm not getting pulled over. So it was just, these perceptions have absolutely everything to do with people's experiences, in addition to these very powerful spatial imaginaries that we've all been talking about.
Thank you, Jody. I want to wrap us up. This is going to be our last question before we turn to the audience to ask a bunch of questions. So please put your questions into the chat box now so we can be sure to get to you. But I want to understand the ways in which you guys are talking about particular imaginations, but also particular kind of spatial and political characteristics of suburbs that in some ways actually exacerbate the kind of racialized police violence. I'm thinking about Ferguson and the need to sort of tax residents in order to make up for home property values that are actually taxes, which are actually lower in suburbs, but actually generate more funds than in the city, but how that was born on the backs of Black folks, which actually led to a kind of particular kind of racialized policing practices to make up for that debt, right? So I want to understand how you guys think about the particularities of suburban space as actually exacerbating some of the trends that we're seeing. And then on the flip side, I want to know your thoughts about how it might undermine or at least change the nature of protest. Because some of what I've seen in my work is that there's a small number of nonprofit organizations that are largely service providers that are working in suburbs. And while they have the goal of organizing around certain issues, police violence and otherwise, don't have the capacity to do those. So they're serving a large number of constituents across a large and diverse amount of space, and they simply don't have the capacity to do that. And because communities have also moved to suburbs relatively recently, they're also not organized in the same kind of communities and through the same sort of networks that they might in inner cities. So I'm wondering if you can talk both about the policing practices and how they're exacerbated or shaped by suburbs, and also then organizing and how it might be undermined by its suburban location.
I'll say one of the things I highlight in my work is the overlapping policing. So we know that historically Black folks have been over-policed and under-policed, right? One thing to sort of think about, particularly that people learned coming on the heels of Ferguson, was that here in this region, like some other places, there are overlapping jurisdictions. And so if you don't get caught up, so to speak, by one, you're certainly capable or likely to get caught up about 3, 4, 5, 6, take a pick, others. And that is not just at the local level, meaning the municipal level, but then there is an overlapping or inclusion of state policing. And then you've got, so for example, so there are the municipal policing occurring here from one suburban community to the next within the broader St. Louis County or broader St. Louis suburban space, right? These individual competing municipalities. Then you've got an overarching policing agency, which oversees all the totality of incorporated spaces that don't have their own individual governments, and that in some ways step in to assist or take ownership or oversight in even some of the municipal policing. Then you've got state intervention, so to speak, or state threat. We can just really and truly say that if we're speaking from the perspective of the Black experience, because that's what then happens when we start to see this mobilization effort or, of sending in, let's just say National Guard, sending in, like when feds, the federal levels. I've covered communities where they had FBI, they had municipal policing, they had state National Guard. This has played out in my work on several occasions, these layers and layers. Ferguson, again, I stress that, is not new in this region. It was new to much of the world, I think because of the provocativeness of it all, and because Mike Brown laid in the street, and it was so, the overtness of his killing and that whole deal, the use, and it would make for another conversation, but there is some politics even in who gets to be identified as a victim in the Black community. And so those things have, again, are not new with Ferguson, and it's certainly not new. So I stress that this is a continuum. Even how we talk about Black movement, it is a continuum. The narrative, even in the current, with things that are occurring on the heels of Minneapolis, is often sort of, it has now been captured as, this is the start of a movement. No, it's a continuum. The movement has not been on pause. What's been on pause is the coverage of the Black folks in these, again, invisible spaces, and how they have mobilized. And the mobilization that I talk about is individual mobilization. That's what I found. I also found formal participation. So individual integration, formal participation. It was not a monolithic way in which Black folks mobilized in these very racialized and political spaces, in these spaces where there had been everyday overlapping police jurisdictions and so forth that were occurring regardless of someone being killed. There have been countless instances where people have been over-policed across jurisdiction, again, without notice. Brown's death called attention to it. And that continues to be the case even as we speak. There have been some of these municipalities who have come together in some ways and coalesced under one umbrella, but still, there is still layers and layers of structural and institutional arrangements that make it virtually inescapable for poor Black folks, especially who are residing or traveling and migrating in and out of these spaces.
Great answer, great answer. I wanna pick up on the flip side. So the flip side is considering the role of protest and organizing. And one of the things that I've done in this recent project is really follow around a number of groups that were doing organizing in spaces outside of the city. So I began the project in Yonkers following a group that was trying to establish a school that was place-based, that had a liberation curriculum, that was trying to center the experiences and lives of Black students and Black folks from the neighborhood. And they literally cleaned up a site that had been shuttered, a site that was actually a historic, like, school desegregation experiment in Yonkers, and they cleaned it up, and then they got the city council to put open a pitch competition, and they pitched, and they were this close to having the school to create a community institution, and the city gave the school to a developer, right? Now this is like 5 years ago. The developer still hasn't developed anything there, but one of the first things I recognized was that even when residents were coming together quickly, when residents were literally identifying blighted space, when they were saying, this is what we want to do, the competing set of interests between what Black residents and poorer residents want and what city governance does, they can be miles away. So this led me to start to talk to more folks around, well, what are the things that you care about in the area? Do you care about housing? So I began to do some work with great organizers and activists of Community Voices Heard. And Community Voices Heard is a national network, but they have a place in Harlem. They also have a place in Yonkers, but the place in Yonkers is for Westchester County. Westchester has about 20 municipalities, and they functionally had one organizer trying to coordinate across those municipalities and trying to educate people to activate them. You literally have to make a decision around the capacity you have. You have to figure out what it is that you want to organize for. So in the case of thinking about housing in a place like Yonkers or New Rochelle or even PG County, what does it mean to have a set of folks who have moved to these places and bought homes, and this is their achievement of the dream? And then to come to them and say, you know, housing within this space is not affordable. You know that plenty of folks are getting pushed out by landlords who literally do them dirty every kind of way, right? People will say, yes, I'm concerned about that, but I'm also concerned about lower income people moving in. So there ends up being a class conflict that is central to tensions around organizing. And so I think there's a class dimension, there's a governance dimension. There's also the dimension of how people coalesce in multiracial coalitions. So looking at the work, particularly of groups in New Rochelle, which is a more affluent suburb than Yonkers, it is a smaller space, but watching them as they try to fight off the hiring of a new superintendent, a superintendent who came from New York City, who lost their job and was suing for reverse discrimination. This gives you a hint about the politics of the superintendent. And in one of the state's most diverse school systems, Black parents, white parents, Latinx parents, low-income parents, middle-income parents stood up at school board meeting after school board meeting and sent letters and campaigned and said, do not appoint this woman. She'll lead to fracturing a lot of the work that we're trying to do. We can't trust somebody who literally believes reverse discrimination is a thing to lead our schools and our children. And yet the school board didn't relent. So there are many ways that the voices that get heard in these different communities have to be pulled apart. Now, when I talk about suburban space and activism, people are often like, well, Doomy, what's a happy tale? And I'm like, I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the place where people come together and coalesce and their voice is heard. One of the dangers of suburban space is that white residents may not be organized in the same ways, but when they begin to speak, they're listened to differently. And that's why when in this moment of protest and uprising, and I love that we're finally having conversations about abolition. And I've identified as an abolitionist, and I'm like, great. But recently I've heard more discussions around this notion of, if you want to know what abolition looks like, just look in the suburbs. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not start it, but she certainly has used it a couple times. And as someone who has studied the experiences of lower income folks, of Black middle-class folks, of Latinx folks who are affluent, I'm like, they get policed more harshly than nearly anyone else. The reason that white residents are often able not to call the police is because if you are unhoused and you are in the center of town in a suburb, you're getting picked up by the police. You're getting harassed and followed around in stores. policing is used in selective ways to solidify and to hoard power for certain sets of residents. If we don't understand that policing is fundamentally about control and power, we fall into the myth that suburban space is perfect. Suburban space has never been perfect. As Jody pointed out, as Andrea pointed out, there's a long history of historically Black suburbs. There's a long history of historically white suburbs, and the contestation within them should demonstrate to us that this will not be an easy struggle. And if we look at suburban space as something, it should be a lab for what is potentially possible, but also the limits of how anti-Black racism, how xenophobia and nativism can limit opportunities.
Yeah, well, again, I really appreciate these comments and wholeheartedly agree. I think when we're talking about a couple of themes that came up with both Dumi and Drea were talking. One is that invisibility, the invisibility of non-white communities that live in the suburbs that Drea was talking about, as well as this invisibility of the policing. So when we say that, well, abolition of the police looks like the suburbs, obviously people really aren't seeing the policing that occurs in the suburbs. Another issue is this, how do people push back in the suburbs? And, I think that in studying just the last 50 years of a place like North St. Louis County, the initial way to push back, as I was saying at the beginning, was to play by the rules. That there was kind of this promise that if you did the right things, if you were elected to political office, if you were responsible in terms of how you led, and that you would be recognized as an authentic suburb, as a part of this larger, in this case, St. Louis County, that you would get, your piece of the pie. And I think what a lot of Black leaders found when they did achieve, kind of that status, was that they weren't granted those things that were promised. So it was kind of this bait and switch that, constantly has happened in that history. So, it also brings up, like, what are the metrics of success? So again, thinking about the case study of Pagedale, which again is very different from Ferguson, has been, over 90% African American since the 1980s. Again, Black leadership throughout that entire time. And the leaders, at least from what I could, in my study, basically said, well, if we can't, we played by the rules and it didn't work, we're going to do it ourselves. And they did. So from a community development standpoint, Pagedale's a huge success. They brought in a grocery store, a health center, they built senior housing, they have a movie theater. The list goes on, and they work with a holistic community development agency in St. Louis to do it, and have really accomplished a lot. What was really hard for me to face when I started to really dig into the research and talk to people and actually look at policing records, look at the data, was that there was this whole other kind of invisible group of people who you never really heard from, you never saw, and those were the people who were being constantly policed, constantly fined and taken into court, who were, and these, so some of these were older citizens who had lived there for decades. Others were people who officials would talk about as kind of pass-throughs. They were renters, they'd be there for a few months maybe, or people who were living with family members. So there's kind of this whole, I don't know, other level, they were not the people who were showing up at community meetings. They were not the people, you know, who were really participating in, quote, their civic duty. So consequently, they had no voice. So, you know, we have to be, I think, really vigilant in understanding the whole picture of invisibility, and as well as this kind of what does it mean to push back? Because you can certainly say that the you know, the women who have held office in Pagedale all these years have certainly pushed back, and they've certainly accomplished a lot. But there is this other side of that story that I think is really important to remember.
Well, can I add real quick?
Sure, we're running a little short on time. I'd like to get to the audience questions, but please feel free, Andrea.
Okay, so real quick, first I want to say, you know, I want to recognize the participants in my projects because they are, again, those invisible folks. Many of them are not attached per se to formal organizing in a particular way, but they are boots on the ground. They're in the trenches, and they're in the trenches oftentimes in very sacrificial ways, apart from the lens of CNN, MSNBC, and the like. We like to tune into that. There seems to be a fetish, a provocativeness attached to, you know, this sort of the show of it all. And so I want to highlight that too. What people see, there's been a discussion, or at least assertions about abolitionism, right? And so people have been moved along, even in terms of organizing individually or otherwise. Folks who may have initially been open to reform have been moved along. What we watch on TV, when you are actually on the ground in the thick of that, there is something to be said when you got dogs yapping at your ankles, when you are standing under a tank, when you are running from tear gas and rubber bullets in the heat of the moment, and you know full well the world is watching and nobody's checking for you. Yeah, that's how that feels. In real time, I want to communicate that. That's how that feels in real time. We stood out there understanding this is what people feel in real time. These are the nuances that don't get captured in between the headlines. There is an understanding, there is a hurt, an incredible pain that people have to wrap their minds around, because it is not like the world. So there's one thing when people don't see the exchanges that are happening every day on a block. It's another when you know the world is tuned in. And nobody stops the real-time stuff. So whatever is playing out, you just get the worst end of it. And then it gets politicized hours later through pundits and otherwise. And you standing there and you've been on the brunt end of it all. There is something to be said. See, that kind of stuff don't get captured because it's not known, it's not understood, it's not sexy in the literature. People don't talk about that on the panels. And we need to, which means then we have to be engaged in a different kind of way, which also then means we got to step outside of the comfort of our cushiony academic spaces, and, you know, and engage in a very different way to where we can have a much broader and larger and in-depth conversation.
That is real. Thank you for that, Andrea. Powerful. I want to, I've heard a lot of great chatter in the box. I want to thank everybody who's attended. There's been over 100 attendees to this event, and almost all of you guys have stuck with us. And so thank you for that. There's been great chatter in the box about Karens, actually. And so I wanted to pose this question to y'all to think about the ways in which particularly Karens, which we're identifying here as privileged white women, are empowered by particular imaginations as well as actual practices of suburban policing. And when and control, right? How are they seen as being particularly in place, and how is the imagination of Black folks being out of place in particular types of suburban spaces increasing or exacerbating the kind of racialized violence that we're seeing. And in that question, I wonder if we could tap into another question that's been asked, which is about the particular types of policing practices in suburbs and how it goes beyond just the kind of formalized policing practices that we're talking about to other kinds of informalized policing practices. So park policing, so code enforcement, and other types of operations of control that also are a form of violence and marginalization.
So I'll offer just some thoughts around the question of Karens, and particularly Karens in predominantly white suburban spaces. So the predominant form of policing that I see in predominantly white suburban spaces is surveillance, right? So there's surveillance by the police. So talking to residents and saying, look, I have to talk to my child about who they're with and what you do after school and where you go, because you're more likely, even if you are in a mixed race group, you're the one who's going to get pulled out of the car. You're the one who's going to get questioned, right? There's a functional policing of space and saying you are out of place, right? Raising questions, particularly when young Black kids are congregated in any space that's a predominantly white suburb. There are often white women who are saying, where are you supposed to be? Weren't you in school? Raising questions, and if not just raising questions directly in an accusatory fashion towards young Black people in particular, then calling on other forms of authority to try to get people out of physical space. Karens also do a tremendous amount of policing about folks who are unhoused, right? So I often talk about lower income people in predominantly white suburban spaces, because I think there's also a category of low income that relates to the poverty line, but there is a discomfort with folks who are low income and unhoused in these spaces. And so while the narrative is often about being concerned for their well-being, the narrative is about, I want to make sure I'm used to who's usually around here and this person seems out of place. The first line of defense is to call the police, and it is functionally weaponizing police to police the boundaries of who belongs there. So I think that there are ways in which I've seen Karens try to flip their privilege, right? I've seen it happen. I'm not sure it's as effective. Again, when Karens show up in service of social justice, they get acknowledged, but they don't get listened to. When they show up to advance the status quo, the creation of dominant white space, they are absolutely the victims, and they are still the ones who are using the state as a form of aggression.
I'll add and say that when we think about Karens, we can think about that as, this is going to be challenging a little bit perhaps, as an extension of slave patrol. So there are many routes by which Black folks have been historically policed, right? And so the idea, even in times of enslavement, was the understanding was that slave patrol were responsible for oversight of Black folks, right? Enslaved Africans. And so apart from slave patrol, there had also been an understanding, a wide and broad understanding, that if slave patrol wasn't directly policing the enslaved populations, that white people in general had a right to. It was a civic obligation. So you didn't have to necessarily be attached or a member of the slave patrol. It was your civic duty as a white person culturally to make sure that enslaved or Black persons and populations were meeting the obligations of slave codes, Black codes, Jim Crow laws, which are all still very much in effect. We just don't term them and reference them that way. But there is still this informal and formal expectation of what Black etiquette should look like, where Black folks should be found, when and under what circumstances. And because there is no longer the existence of a slave patrol, there is still the extension, the byproducts of that having been established. The byproducts of the slave patrol is what we see carried out in policy and practice, not only through law enforcement, but what we also see carried out by white populations, white persons who have never been commissioned. There is still a furtherance of this cultural understanding that white folks have the right, the civic obligation and duty to police Black people, irrespective of having ever gone to the academy. And so Karen is an extension of that. And
one thing I would just add is, there are the there's the Karen behavior that we all kind of know and recognize out in public, and the ones who are, you know, weaponizing the police, the ones who are confronting different situations. You know, the 20 years I lived in St. Louis, I lived in University City, which is one of those, quote, diverse suburbs that, you know, Dumi talks about, where people move there because it's so diverse, and they want their children to be surrounded by, you know, all kinds of people. But there's so much of that kind of policing that only happens behind closed doors, and it happens in very coded language. So there's a lot of Karens who would never speak in public of these things, but you know, on the playground or behind closed doors, or, you know, in those kinds of situations, it's another form of informal policing that, you know, we don't even see in terms of maintaining the status, maintaining the boundaries. You know, this is, I want this, you know, much diversity, but not that much. And so, you know, especially, obviously it really shows up in schools, you know, in all of these places where people feel like they have a right to maintain the privilege that they think that they, you know, earned or whatever.
Also had this great sort of conversation happening about affluent white spaces, and we're oftentimes talking about the spaces where Black folks have moved to and disrupted some of the earlier forms of white segregation. But we also know that white affluent suburbs are the most segregated spaces in America. Actually, we tend to describe those as Black spaces, but Black folks actually live in much more integrated communities. So there's questions surrounding disrupting those kind of spaces, activating protest in those spaces, and one by my great friend Orly Clerget, who's one of our suburban inequality scholars that's particularly thinking about the notions of property and the protection of property as central to the way that we think about policing in suburbs.
White affluent space has become space of resistance. If we're thinking about organizing and things like that, that's one. I mean, there's so many different ways to sort of account for that, but it has been this pseudo safety net, so to speak, but it has also, if we're thinking in terms of movement and mobilization and collective action and what that has looked like in the suburbs, that space has also become space of resistance. Why? Because the logic here on the ground is that we go where you are. Participants have commonly and routinely made a point to show up in white space, because the notion has been, as long as you stay over there, then we're good. But if disruption is what the movement is set out to do, that has meant crossing more boundaries, particularly and especially into affluent white space, because what movement folk have wanted white affluent populations to know is that you can't come down to the city or come into Black spaces for the sake of working and then escape back to the suburbs after 5, or escape back to your gated community after 5. So folks show up there, folks show up at the mall. Yeah, there's a highway shutdown going to happen. Why? Because that disrupts the flow of white pseudo safety, so to speak. And then we start to see other dynamics, because of course then fear increases more. So it becomes this circular thing, but it is appropriated even on the end of Black folks, and delegated or relegated in a way that it becomes opportunity and space even for further resistance. I'm sorry, Dumi. It looks like I just hopped in there on you.
No, you good money. You good money. That was great. That was great. I'll compliment, and I want to make, and it's a false distinction for a second, between movement work and kind of some of the protests that we're seeing popping up in historically and predominantly white small suburbs and towns, right? So movement work is going to shut down a highway. Spontaneous suburbs may be like, hey, let's meet up downtown and let's march together. Right? One of the things that I'm seeing in white spaces, and right now this is still anecdotal because I haven't had a chance to field a survey or anything, but the gateway into these conversations about addressing Black life in predominantly white spaces is a public protest and then discussions about school. School becomes that common place where Black folks, white folks, Latinx folks, to some degree, have a competition for resources, and a lot of Black families who are organizing are now saying, this is the place where we have some leverage, right? We can talk about the curriculum. We can talk about disproportionate suspension. We can talk about the ways in which we've been marginalized within this space, and this is the gateway. So I've been like, just for the last month or so, getting tons of emails from different communities and folks saying, hey, we're organizing to try to get rid of the superintendent. We're organizing to try to do this. And I'm like, it's interesting because while it could be a larger conversation about extrajudicial killings, it could be something about housing opportunity, folks seem to be fixated, and I think for good reason, on the competition and the opportunity hoarding around schools. So I think there's a lot of different things that are happening in protests, and we have to think about, as folks have mentioned already, there's a wide chorus of voices springing up now. And we as scholars, we can't touch them all, but we can learn from these different voices and see what it means ultimately. And Orly, I would answer your question, but I would just tell everyone buy The New Noir out on California Press, because it is a brilliant historiographical work, sociological work, but just like, no one can do Orly's questions justice.
So I'm going to ask one last question to our panelists, which hopefully will wrap in some of the other things that I've seen here on the chat box, which is trying to think about the scale of solutions to defund or abolish the police or other kinds of interventions that we might think about. So I had one question from my friend Eric Hyra that is about urban, suburban versus metropolitan, but I've also heard a lot of chatter about the ways in which the kind of organizing around suburban protectionism, and particularly protectionism of white supremacist spaces, happens online, right? And particularly in spaces of suburbs, you have these neighborhood watch groups that are oftentimes digitally connected. And so a lot of this is this kind of collective organizing that is actually producing a lot of the anti-Black violence in suburbs is happening outside of actual physical space. So can we talk about the lines of policy disruption that might, cross those urban, suburban, metropolitan divides, but also think about outside of physical space?
It's a great question. I'll simply offer this, right? So the organizer in me always says, well, what's the specific problem you want to address? And sometimes it has a larger radius, and sometimes there's only a space that you can impact it. So thinking about some of the organizing work that I've seen happen in Westchester around housing. Westchester has plenty of areas of affluence, like super, super rich, right? Hillary Clinton rich, right? And places of poverty. One of the things that a lot of organizers on the ground were saying was that the structure of how we define affordable housing is skewed because of how bifurcated our population is. And we actually need a different metric for determining affordable housing that will actually be meaningful for lower income folks in this space. And so I watched them organize out of Yonkers, out of Mount Vernon, out of New Rochelle, and kind of push it out to Westchester County to say, we need to change how we determine this. I've also seen them organize in that way to do a rent freeze, right? So working in a way that kind of spreads out. Now that's heavily strategic work, right? And it deals with very local impacts, because there are plenty of spaces in the county that a rent freeze means nothing because they have less than 2% of folks in their town or city rent. But for folks where there's higher concentrations of renters, et cetera, it's super meaningful. So I think we have to figure out the problem, its radius, and where we can inject the most resources.
I guess I'll say in terms of scale, you mentioned scale of solutions. that can go so many different directions. I think what I will do is center the more immediate. And so I want to make sure I clarify two things. There is a lot of conflating when it comes to Black folks. You know, there's this suggestion that, racist suggestion that if you've seen one, you've seen them all. And so that approach is also happening sometimes with the way in which Black folks organize. And so the movement for Black lives is not the same as Black Lives Matter. I want to clarify and distinguish certain things, because when we start talking about policies and the notion, and so let me separate. I don't want to ramble. That's one thing I want to call attention to. There is movement for Black lives, and then there is Black Lives Matter. Those are two different things. Those are two different organizations. Black Lives Matter is characterized and structured around chapters. Movement for Black lives is a collective. It is a collective of organizations, a collective of grassroots mobilizing. I say that because what happens is they get conflated. And so then in the counter attacks, it's an opportunity to conflate and attack all folks that are Black. And so I also want to distinguish that when we talk about abolitionism, the move either way, particularly for Black folks and participants here in St. Louis who often don't attach themselves or sort of, have had so many grassroots organizations of their own to morph and emerge and grow on the heels of Ferguson. Oftentimes, the idea of reform is out the door. People are done with that. That's like an exhaustive option at this point. I said earlier, people have been moved along. There's been 400 years of efforts or quote unquote attempts for reform. And much of that gets tied and tangled up in the system. We're still early in the grand scheme of things, even coming on the heels of Minneapolis. And so court hearings and trials and so forth, those things have yet to take place. And so again, folks are, at least many of the participants are and organizers and some of the movement leaders and activists. And when I say activists, not folks who periodically show up for direct action, but folks who are often on the front lines, the people that take the death threats daily, all day, that don't get discussed in the media as well. Those folks are more or less moving again steadfastly with abolitionism and the idea of disrupted altogether, because there are way too many layers. There's no reform at this point that can have a tremendous effect, really, in the way that will preserve or at least provide safety, true safety for Black folks without disrupting the entire system. And as it stands, the system is so layered into, there's politics and everybody would have to be on the same page. History has shown, even up to the current, that people are not willing to be on the same page.
I just want to jump in real quick to address two parts of that. Yeah, echoing what Drea was just talking about, all I want to say is, one thing that I try to really convey at the end of the book that just came out is that, people think that the Ferguson protest movement was something that happened in 2014, 2015, but it absolutely has never stopped, even though we haven't heard about it. You don't see it in the newspapers. You don't see what's actually happening, what Dre is talking about, what's on the ground. It has not stopped. It has continued every single day. And we're starting to see that fact now, today, and people think, oh, it's picking up where they left off. Well, they never stopped. So I want to make that absolutely clear, that, this movement that I really came to feel emanated from this place has been there and continues to be there, and they are done. Dre is absolutely right with reform, that they've seen all of the broken promises that have occurred over time in the everything is kind of heightened in that context. And the only other thing I would kind of going back to that first question is, you know, I came to this work as an architect and an urban designer. And so when we talk about, you know, what can we do in this context and different kind of interventions and kind of in the physical context, my view, and I alluded to this a little while ago, you know, what I used to think was success in terms of community development, or, you know, if you talk to enough community members, if you have enough input, if you know, you did your job, most people are happy, you really didn't do your job. I think we really have to think about how we determine the metrics, and it's not just, you know, who has been helped, but who were the people that not only might they not have been helped, but were harmed. And we really don't want to look at that. And even people will say, well, more people were helped than hurt. Well, if you actually, in the big scheme of things, if you do that long enough, then, you know, it's not the kind of progress, I think, that I would argue that we're looking for. So that's something. And then, but yeah, well, we're out of time. I'll just stop there because we're kind of pushing time.
And in that spirit, I think we should wrap up by thanking people who are currently out on the streets when we are in the comfort of our own homes, and are continue to hold this fight and continue to push at all levels, not just urban or suburban or metropolitan, but in all kinds of spaces. But thank you to all of you who, I know some of you guys have been out on the streets for the last several days as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time. And I do want to thank some of our sponsors for this event as well. My own department, the School of Architecture, Planning, Preservation, and Real Estate Development at the University of Maryland, Dawn Dow, the director and sponsor from the Critical Race Initiative, and at UC Davis, the Center for Regional Change. And a special thanks to Noelle Alvarez, who's brought us together and has done so much of the legwork for this. She is currently dropping into the chat box a link to all of the books that the authors here have produced. So if you're looking to learn more about their work and deepen your understanding of the suburban policing and protest, please follow that link. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Willow.